President Trump is using a caravan of around 1,000 migrants crossing Mexico as the, quote, crisis that's forcing him to order troops to the border. Many migrants in the group say regardless of what Trump says or does, they won't be deterred from heading to the U.S. border. But the Mexican government has already convinced the majority of the migrants to disband when they reach Mexico City. The government is giving many of them humanitarian visas so they can stay in Mexico. Now, one such migrant is a teenager from El Salvador who fled to the U.S. years ago. He had previously been recruited into the violent gang MS-13. He was afraid he would be killed and was seeking protection, so he became a police informant in New York. But now he's regretting that decision to put his life in jeopardy to help the police because now he's facing deportation. To hide his identity, he's simply being called Henry. His story was recently featured in a number of publications because instead of protecting him, law enforcement turned Henry over to immigration officials, and now his life is even more at risk than it was before. Henry was in court today for his final immigration hearing. To discuss this case and the problem of not protecting immigrant informants is Ernie Collette. He's a staff attorney with Mobilization for Justice. Thank you so much, Ernie, for being here.
Thank you for having me.
So this case is a little disturbing.
To say the least. It's one of those situations where this young man, a high school student, not wanting to be, continued to be recruited by MS-13, after writing sort of his feelings on a piece of paper and sharing it with his teacher, who then reported it to a school resource officer, and then involved the situation where he became an informant, really was abandoned by all parties and had the information that he eventually was using to help in the arrest of individuals responsible for 2 brutal murders out in Suffolk County, to now unfortunately be placed in detention and possibly have his opportunity to stay in the United States denied, and if returned to El Salvador, the possibility of being killed by the same gang he's trying to prevent himself from being a part of.
When we talk about these cases, often gangs try to intimidate people into not talking because of retaliation. Was there a misunderstanding somewhere along the line that he would think he would get this protection?
I don't believe that there was. I mean, if you look at the evidence from many reputable news sources that actually detailed in specific, he has text messages and conversations with an individual who stated that he was part of an FBI task force to go after gangs in Suffolk County. He felt that there was going to be enough protection for him that if he provided and voluntarily gave this information, which was extremely dangerous for him due to the circumstances of the brutal attacks that have been going on Long Island, that he would be offered some sort of protection. And it appears that when the police turned the information over to ICE, there was sort of a complete disconnect between the school, the police, and possibly the FBI individual who claimed to be an FBI member of the task force to protect this young man.
Yeah, I spoke with one of the reporters who interviewed Henry, and she described him as a dead man walking because he believes that unless something happens, he will be killed if he is deported or if he's released and not put in some witness protection program. How indicative is this case of this broader issue, protection for immigrant informants?
There have been a lot of documented cases where individuals have not even necessarily been informants, but people who have tried applying for asylum and were denied after waiting years in immigration court, or had a credible fear against their life, but the immigration proceeding was very short. The evidence either wasn't there or they didn't find the individual to be credible. And upon return to their country, months later, many individuals were then found murdered or killed by the same forces or individuals, either a gang member or domestic violence situation that they had claimed to provide to the government to protect them. So it's not uncommon for this young man, Henry, to think because of his deep involvement and detailed involvement in the cases out in Long Island, and because of his prior history in El Salvador at MS-13, that there is a possibility that if he were to go back to El Salvador, not to mention that this is a widely publicized story, a lot of outlets have picked it up, he's given his real first name, his gang alias, that there are individuals that will be able to find him and unfortunately terminate his life.
Ernie, should the police be to blame for this situation?
The police had an obligation, in my opinion, to protect their informants. I think it's pretty well known that if an individual enters into an agreement or enters in, and by the way, he was a minor when he talked to the police, and he was in a situation, it was a school setting in which this sort of contract began, where he would give information. So there should have been more protections, especially for a minor child. But the police had an obligation, at the very least, to inform him or his parents of what his rights are and what he was doing and how much of a risk, even though he knew it, how much of a risk it would be to him. And he provided credible information. The police don't deny that. His attorney doesn't deny that. He's provided information that has led to individuals of the gang being arrested. So to then not protect him seems to be a tragic situation.
So to play devil's advocate, some immigration officials will say that he is no angel. Yes, he turned on other gang members and his information led to arrests, but he himself committed crimes, dangerous, violent crimes. When someone puts that argument out there, how do you respond?
I look at the situation, and in this case, yes, he did commit, he confessed, he admitted to, when he was in El Salvador, murdering an individual.
So he murdered an individual. He was a child, he took part in a gang murder of someone, but even that should not be an excuse?
Well, I would argue that in that situation, specifically, if you read his account and you would have him testify to that, he was under duress. It was under an individual gang member. It was part of a recruitment where you would either be an MS-13, you're either beaten for 13 seconds, or in this situation, you are told to take the life of somebody else, and it's either their life or your life. And he was, I believe, 14 years old when he was asked to take this individual's life. At the same time, there are immigration laws and there are forms of relief that if you commit a crime such as that, you're not going to be eligible for particular forms of relief. So if I was his attorney, one of the things that I would argue, there's two forms that I would look at. I would look at the S visa, which is an informant visa. First, I should say that he has to be found not removable by an immigration judge. And that hearing, his final hearing, happened today, and it may be sort of maybe adjourned at this point. There was information that they may be asking for more information. But at the same time, the S visa is an opportunity for him as an informant. If he provides credible evidence that led to the arrests and protection, he should be afforded that. There's also another opportunity, which is under the Convention Against Torture. It doesn't use the same rules as asylum. It doesn't afford the same protections as asylum as well. So he would, under the Convention Against Torture, he would have to show more likely than not that if he were to return to his country of origin, El Salvador, that he would be tortured. I think the evidence in this case clearly shows that there would be some element of torture, considering the fact that he was already been harassed while in detention, been threatened while in detention. There's a real possibility that he would be killed if he were to go back to El Salvador. He's not afforded protections in the sense that he can travel around outside of the United States. And the only thing he'll be able to get, and it's also you can't get derivative status, which means that he can't ask for family members to come into the United States because of that. He really only can get an opportunity to work if that's a possibility. But you're also looking at the bigger picture here, which is, you know, even if he's afforded that, he can't go back to the place that he called home in the United States. He can't go back to Long Island.
He has to go into hiding.
He'd have to go into hiding. There had to be some sort of protection status, either witness protection from the same agency that you know, has sort of not taken his case to begin with, or he has to go somewhere to be able to be protected from individuals who may know his identity. So at a young age, at his age, you know, he has to go in hiding for a potentially very, very long time.
So if we could talk briefly about the broader implications of this particular case, how can the New York Police Department, or any police department for that matter, ask an immigrant informant to give information knowing that this is a possible outcome?
That's one of the more difficult situations, and one of the things that the advocacy community and attorneys in New York City and in New York State have sort of been telling and arguing against the policies of this administration. By this case is a really principal example of what happens when you ask the community to get involved and you're supposed to offer them protection. And by the community seeing that this individual was not protected and actually put into removal proceedings and could potentially be removed where he could be potentially killed, it's a chilling effect on the community. It's going to prevent police from doing neighborhood policing, and it prevents individuals from coming forward and actually testifying towards crimes because they're afraid. It's another part of the administration's attempts to put fear into the immigrant community. If individuals are afraid that the police are not going to protect them, as a result, they're going to be more reluctant, to go and report crimes to the police. And as a result, crimes will be unreported, and you'll see more situations. Unfortunately, more crime happen out in places like Long Island and all throughout the country.
You speak about fear within immigrant communities, and we also have happening right now this caravan that is in theory heading towards the United States, and the U.S. president sending potentially the National Guard to meet them to prevent them from crossing the border. Do we have an obligation to help those people?
Yes, I feel like we do. Personally, I believe that some of the founding principles of this country is, especially enshrined in here in New York State, is to give us your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free. It's not give us your wealthy, give us your most technically astute. We have an obligation that if somebody is coming to the border and claiming that they are a victim of domestic violence or they're claiming asylum because they are being persecuted in their home country, we should afford them the opportunity to have a credible or reasonable fear screening. And if they can provide the adequate evidence necessary, provide them with refuge and an opportunity to come into the United States. This isn't the first time that we've seen the president react towards these types of situations. We've had several iterations of a travel ban that has prevented refugees and the restriction of refugees.
But this time the troops are heading over there.
Exactly. And we should also say that the president misspoke while saying it was the military instead of the National Guard, which presenting the military to the border would not only heighten relations, escalations with the Mexican government, but also would be frankly illegal. By sending the National Guard there, we still are uncertain. The Secretary of Homeland Security said as many as necessary. We don't know how many are going to go. We still don't know, they're still ironing out sort of the payment structure between the states. The states actually have their own obligations in case there's an emergency where they need to actually deploy their own National Guards to protect their interests in their states. And we still don't know what capacity are they going to be assisting Border Patrol? If so, in what nature? There's a lot left unanswered, and I believe that the reason why this was said is an attempt by the president, by the administration, to rally their base. There's a lot. You can see that actually on Sunday when the president said no more DACA deal, and and sort of trying to attempt to militarize this border. It's a continuing policy of effectively asking, using the base of his base to sort of instoke fear and really prevent the immigrant population from being protected and actually feeling that they actually are protected by our country.
Thank you very much. So much fear right now. Ernie Collette, staff attorney with Mobilization for Justice.